So names. Names are really important, and they kind of set us apart. Each of us has a name, and we're called by that name. And when you combine a name with like history, it's kind of a game changer. And sometimes something or someone is named something in a way that initiates some sort of feeling. Something is often named something and initiates a feeling that we have. And this happens specifically with historical figures and with buildings, for instance. So if I say guaranteed rate field, how many of you know what that is? As I suspected, nobody knows where the White Sox play. It's okay. We understand that. Guaranteed rate field is where the White Sox lose a lot of games. But if I say Wrigley Field, a lot of you would probably know what Wrigley Field is, even if you're not a baseball fan. Or Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park. Those names carry with it something. History has happened there. Things have, it's iconic in a way. But guaranteed rate field does not carry that same weight with it. It's not a lot of history has happened in that ballpark, and we'll pray that not a lot of history continues to happen in that ballpark. But likewise, humans carry with them names given to them by their parents. Historical figures we can recognize based off of names, and we can associate certain things with those names. So if I say Genghis Khan, a lot of us don't really know who I'm talking about, but we kind of know who I'm talking about. We don't know a great deal about him unless we've studied Asian history. But we know he was a tribal leader who conquered much of China and Central Asia. And most likely you've heard of him. And his name brings about with it a lot of legend as well as turmoil, as he was known to be quite brutal and evil. If I say the name George Washington, I would hope that all of you would know who I'm talking about with that name. And what he did, he's kind of known, that name brings about thoughts of humility, as he turned down a kingship and was just a very good leader in a brand new world. Adolf Hitler, that name with it carries with it a lot of historical weight. A lot of things. Obviously, the evil that he caused, causing in the tens of millions of people to die, whether it be by what he did with the Jews or what he caused as a world war. A lot of people died, and his name is kind of synonymous with pure hatred. You don't see a lot of people naming their kid Hitler or Adolf anymore. Jackie Robinson, that's another name. There's a lot less history there, but he broke the color barrier in baseball, and he paved the way for African American players to join baseball. And his name reminds us of bravery as well as just sheer athleticism. And in baseball, every spring they have Jackie Robinson Day, where they all wear the number that Jackie wore, and it's just kind of to honor him. If I say Albert Einstein, we know that he was a German-born theoretical physicist who's often associated with sheer brilliance. If you're called an Einstein, you're known for being smart. And we know that I won't ever be called that, but that's okay. The name Einstein basically carries with it this idea of extreme intelligence. Names matter. I got the privilege, along with Dina, of naming 4 wonderful human beings. And it's likely that none of them will go down in history, but it was a privilege to name each one of them. Their names, they're important. They will be called by that name the rest of their life. Dina and I had a lot of fun picking out names. We were very picky when it came to picking out names. We named Cameron James Walter. And we named him Cameron James Walter because Dina really wanted to name her firstborn son after her grandpa, whose name was Carl James. And he was known by CJ. And so we're like, well, let's name our firstborn son CJ. But we didn't want to name him Carl, so we named him Cameron James Walter with the idea that we would call him CJ. And we never have. We've never called him CJ. He's Cameron. But that's the name we gave him, and it was an honor to give him that name. And we named Melanie Elizabeth Walter, and I loved the name Melanie. I don't know why. I can't really place it. I just thought it was a neat name. And Elizabeth is Dina's middle name, so she carries on Dina's middle name with her, and Melanie is the same initial that I had, so Melanie Elizabeth Walter. With Aaliyah, we had a little bit of fun. because we fell in love with the name Aaliyah. And with all three of the girls, what you need to understand is we played the wait and see game. We didn't know if we were having a boy or a girl. We would find out when they were born. And so we were picking names based off of, well, we need a boy name and we need a girl name. And we fell in love with the name Aaliyah, but we had no idea what to put with it. So we would sit there night after night after night while we were anticipating. We had the boy name picked out, and I can't remember what it was. But we had Aaliyah, and if it was a girl, it was going to be Aaliyah, but we didn't know what to put with it. And so we'd sit there night after night after night putting names with Aaliyah, and we didn't like any of them. And then one night we were sitting there. I hate telling this story because it's so ridiculous. We were sitting there and we're watching TV, and every name that pops up we're throwing along with Aaliyah to see if we like it. And a movie trailer for a movie came on with Reese Witherspoon in it. And we were like, Aaliyah Reese. Oh, I kind of like that. And then we looked at each other and we're like, we can't name her after Reese Witherspoon. And so we just kind of put it on the back burner, and she was born a few weeks later, and sure enough, we had our Aaliyah, and we weren't sure what to put the middle name with, and we were like, why do we care? We're not naming her after that. We like the name, and we named her Aaliyah Reese Walter. With Haley, we refused to believe with our fourth child that there was going to be another girl. So we refused to pick a name for a very long time. And then it was about probably 2 weeks before she was due, and we were like, we better pick a girl name. And so we went back and forth, and finally we decided on Haley, and we decided on Haley Olivia. And we really liked the name Olivia, but we couldn't have Aaliyah and Olivia. We just felt like that was too close. So we named her Haley Olivia Walter. And so I got the honor of naming those four amazing people, and I look forward to seeing what they do in this world. It's a lot about names, but it's actually very applicable to what we're talking about today, because we are going to talk about God's name. And today we're starting a new sermon series that is entitled, I Am I? In the Gospel of John, Jesus on 7 different occasions makes an I am statement that tells his listeners that he is the Son of God. He is proclaiming himself in that moment to be God. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. In each statement, Jesus is declaring he is God and how he functions as the God who saves. And the way he introduces himself as God is through that I am portion of the declaration. It was a fairly inflammatory statement to make. He was declaring himself God. As we will discuss in detail today, God had declared himself I am when he commissioned Moses at the burning bush, and now here was Jesus using that same terminology. He was telling the people that he was God, and he was here to save them, but people got caught up in the I am portion of that because it was pretty aggressive to state that. And so they weren't necessarily sometimes listening to the rest of it. They just heard I am, and they're like, whoa, who are you to say that? Today we will discuss what God meant when he said I am, to help us further understand Jesus' 7 statements that we will discuss in the following 7 weeks. Each week we will look at one statement and see who God says he is, who Jesus says he is, and then we will ask ourselves a question about who we are in response to who God is. And I'm really looking forward to this series, and I hope it will help us to learn a lot about who God is and a lot about who we are. To begin with, we're going to look at the great I am found in Exodus 3. For a quick background, though, before we read out of Exodus 3, we need to remember a few things about our ancient history. Abraham trusted God, and eventually God gave him Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, and God chose Jacob. Jacob had many sons, 12 to be exact. He got to name 12 different children, along with probably some daughters in there. And Joseph was his favorite, but his brothers sold him, and he found himself a servant in Egypt. But Joseph was faithful to God, and God used him to save his brothers in a famine, and the 12 tribes of Jacob came to live in Egypt. They moved to Egypt. And then they were enslaved by Egypt. And Moses was born at a time when the Egyptians were killing baby Hebrew children, boys in particular. So his mom hid him in a basket, and he was saved by Pharaoh's daughter, and he was actually raised in Pharaoh's household. He grew up and had an incident where an Egyptian was beating a Hebrew, and Moses saw this, and Moses went and killed the Egyptian. And after that, he fled in fear to Midian because he was afraid of retaliation. And it was in Midian where he got married, and he started his family, and he worked for his father-in-law. And so with that background, let's read Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Exodus 3 starts a multiple chapter conversation between God and Moses, where God commissions Moses to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt and to the promised land. And within this conversation, a lot of things will be discussed, including God's name, Moses' reluctance, and God outlining his plan of what he's going to do. And we will mostly be looking at the interaction between God and Moses at the burning bush, as this is not a sermon series on the continuing history of Moses and Israel. Moses is out in the land of Midian. He is tending his father-in-law's sheep, and God shows up in this weird attention-getting way to open up a conversation with Moses. And what's interesting is that this is both a common and an uncommon way that God interacts with his people. Multiple times in Scripture, God interacts with his chosen people when they're in the middle of work. It happened to Gideon, it happened to Jeremiah, it happened to David. He meets them well while they're working in an incredible way. They are not seeking him at this moment. We need to understand that. They aren't seeking him. They are going about their business and they're doing what they're called to. And it's important to note that God initiates the conversation. They don't. Moses isn't in the middle of a worship service. He isn't meditating. He is working. And God appears. And he appears in a burning bush, and that's not as common. That's not as common. This interaction isn't just a voice from heaven, but Moses gets a visual of God too. And this bush is on fire and not being consumed. And God, in this instance, gives Moses not just a voice, but a visual representation of his power. And when Moses noticed the bush isn't being consumed, he's intrigued, and he goes over and he investigates, knowing something's up. This is weird. And then God speaks and does two things in his first few sentences. He establishes his authority and the way he should be approached, and he identifies himself. God identifies himself. God, though, calls Moses by his name. He says, Moses, Moses. Moses was given that name not by his mother, but by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter gave him the name Moses. She adopted him and she gave him the name. And now God is calling him by that name, saying, Moses, Moses. This calling of his name combined with the visual sight of the burning bush causes Moses to stop and proclaim, Here I am, a proper way to address God in that moment when God is getting your attention. But we need to stop there for just a second and react because I don't know how I would react in that situation, and I'm not sure you know how you would react in that situation. You see this crazy fire that isn't consuming the product of the bush, and a voice comes out of that bush and says your name twice. That would be weird. That would be weird, and I'm thinking most of us would be at least stunned. Some might choose to run away in fear. And I think Moses understood that this was God very quickly. And even though he was probably in fear, he chose to await the message from God. And when God wants to get your attention, how do you respond? Do you ignore it, or do you pay attention to it when God is trying to get your attention? And God then tells him, take off your sandals, for the ground you are standing on is holy ground. And this is God expecting respect in his presence. How we approach God is very important. He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is the Almighty God. And I think we should be careful how we approach him. And I could go off on that subject for a long time. It's one of my favorites. But I'll hold back just to say, our God is worthy of our respect and worship. And he's worthy of how we approach him with fear and with awe. After saying that, God identifies himself for the first time. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And by doing this, he is showing that he is the God who Moses' ancestors worshiped, the God who Israel worshiped. This is an important identification that he will hit again a little later on in the conversation. So Moses right away realizes he is interacting with God. And he shows the humility that God deserves. He hides his face. He has an appropriate fear of the Lord. Let's read on in the text, verses 7 through 12. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my children, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should bring and go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, but I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. The purpose of the burning bush experience was to commission Moses to lead the people of Israel out of slavery and to the promised land. And what we see in this section is God's plan to reveal to Moses, and he struggles to accept that mission. And he begins to try to reject God's mission for him. God then begins to negotiate with Moses to bring him to a proper understanding, not of who Moses is, but of who God is. God begins by telling Moses that he has not left his people. He sees their struggle in Egypt, and he has heard their cry for help, and it is time for him to deliver them. And I need to stop there for just a moment to talk real quick about a very difficult subject. You see, the people of Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years, according to Exodus 12:40. And many, if not most of those years, had been in slavery, where for generations they multiplied, amassing a huge nation. Generations, though. For generations they had cried out. That means people had lived their entire life calling out to God to be delivered. And then the generation that followed them did the same thing, calling out to God to be delivered. And God hadn't done it yet. God was hearing his people, but was not delivering them yet. Egypt felt threatened by this group, and they dealt harshly with them to the point that even in Moses' infancy, the Egyptians were killing the baby boys of the Hebrews. Israel was crying out for years. Probably in the 400-year range, they had been crying out. And God had heard their cry. Now, I want us to recognize that we've adopted a version of God that because he doesn't answer our pain immediately, he's a bad God. We've put that on him. That's a little arrogant, in my opinion. And I've been guilty of it too. God, why haven't you done this yet? For generations, the Israelites were crying out. God heard them. We have this idea of, as a people, that if we call out to God and he doesn't answer us, that he doesn't care. And I don't think that's an accurate description of God. I don't. God is all powerful. He is in and through everything, and he always has the bigger picture in sight that we cannot see. He sees things through eternity. If God rushed to Israel the moment that things got hard for Israel, they would not have been a very big nation. 12 tribes went, 12 sons with their families went. They were soon enslaved. If God answers their call and their cry immediately, they're probably only a couple hundred people. They needed time to grow as a nation. And the enslavement made them ripe for growth. They multiplied rapidly, becoming a huge group of people over 430 years, most likely in the neighborhood of a couple million people. And that huge group of people was needed because they were going to take over the promised land. God was playing the long game. And I don't like saying God was playing a game. I'm just trying to bring around that idea that God had a lot longer down the history in line. He was also already working towards the Messiah that had to happen in the right time. God knew what man didn't know. He knew what Israel didn't, and he waited patiently for the right time to deliver his people. And God isn't always going to come to our rescue when life is hard. He's not always going to do that, and that's a very difficult pill to swallow. Sometimes God isn't going to deliver us from the struggle. Sometimes God is saying, trust me in the struggle. Trust me in the struggle. He isn't created for us. God isn't created for us. He doesn't live at our beck and call, and we are created for him. And he provides hope even in the most dire of circumstances because God has eternity in his mind. God is playing the long game. So will we submit to him as our God and trust that his way is right way, even if it doesn't make sense to us? And that's a big question that we each need to answer. I'm not sure what that sound is. We'll get it figured out in the coming weeks. All right. God had heard the cry of his people, and he was ready with a plan. That plan was to send Moses to lead them out of Egypt. And he said, here I am sending you to Pharaoh. And when God says to Moses, when God says this to Moses, Moses gets very nervous. But even though he's starting to question the choice of him, he asks the right question. He says, who am I that I should approach Pharaoh? And I do believe that is, in some ways, at least, the right question to ask. Moses asks, who am I? And it shows his humility, which is one of the reasons I believe Moses was chosen, but it's also a question I think we need to ask of God. Who do you say I am? How are you going to use me? And the question is framed in a short rebuttal of God's plan. We need to keep that in mind. It's not a perfect question, but it's an important one nonetheless. Moses thinks he's a nobody. Moses thinks nobody's going to follow me. Moses doesn't think he's qualified to be used this way. Moses doesn't trust himself. Moses is haunted by his past mistakes. Moses thinks someone else is a better choice. Who am I? And God's response to that question is quite interesting because he doesn't answer Moses who he is. Notice God's answer to that question in Exodus 3:12. But I will be with you, he says, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Moses asks God who he is to lead the people, and God answers, I am with you. And that's all you need to know. We make so many things about ourselves. God has a plan, and God was always going to make that plan happen. He didn't need Moses. He chose Moses. Moses asks, who am I? And God says, it's not about you. Look what I'm about to do through you. Look what I'm about to do. I will be with you. Have you ever rejected an opportunity to serve God because you thought you weren't the right person? Well, maybe the question isn't, are you the right person? Maybe it's all about God being able to do immeasurably more in and through what you think can happen and what you imagine can happen. God can do more. And I have to laugh about this sign that God gives him. He says, and this will be a sign to you. In the future, you're going to see it. Instead of reassuring him with a wonder, he says, you just wait and see. When I have accomplished through you what I'm going to accomplish, you are going to worship me on this mountain. Mount Horeb is where he was tending his sheep and where he encountered God in the burning bush. It's also known as Mount Sinai, where God would deliver the 10 commandments to Moses. Moses did indeed worship God on that mountain. He saw that sign. If God wants to use you, just go along for the ride. Because he never stops doing good things, and you will get to be a part of the process. Exodus 3:13 through 17. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob has appeared to me saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and Hivites. I got that out of order. And a land flowing with milk and honey. That's what he says to him. Well, what's your name? Who do I say sent me? He says, I am who I am. And that's a weird statement, but it's a great statement if you think about it. Here is where we get to the biggest moment in the conversation. Moses asks God to identify himself. He's worried since he is not a leader of Israel and is not widely known by Israel, that if he says, God sent me to lead you out of slavery, that Israel's going to reject him. And so God says his name. He says, I am who I am. In the Hebrew, which I'm going to butcher, it's Aher Asher Aher. Sorry, I did worse. I practiced that, and I did really pretty well when I practiced it. I just butchered it. It was bad. The name consists of a repeated verb translated to be, which is the first person form. In the third person form, Yahweh. Other translations include, I will be who I will be. I will cause to be what I will cause to be. I will be who I am. I am who I will be. I will be God for you. His answer when he says the name is, I will be God for you. You don't worry about that. Here's my name. This is what I will be known as. I like how the commentary puts it. The author states, the force is not simply that God is or that God is present, but that God will be faithfully God for them. I am who I am. I am God. And I am all you need. He then goes on to tell Moses, tell them that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob has sent me to you. Coupling this second time of referencing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, along with saying, I am who I am, God is indicating not just a confidence that he is with his people, but also that he is the God who has always been with his people. I am that God who was there with Abraham. I am that God who was with Isaac. I am that God who is with Jacob, and I am that God who is with you, and I will be that God you will worship on the mountain. I'm the God who has always been. If Moses is worried that he isn't the right person to lead this charge, God is basically telling him, I've got this. I have been with my people in every part of their existence, and I will be their God all the way through the time you worship me on this mountain. God is saying, I am who I am. I am with you. I am with my people. I am your God. I will always be your God. I will always be with you. I am for you. I am in control. I am the Alpha and Omega. I am going to do amazing things. I am going to deliver you. I am who I am. And that's all you need. So the question is, am I willing to trust the great I am? We know the rest of the story. Moses is still reluctant and negotiates some things with God, but God uses Moses despite his perceived flaws, because when the I am says he is going to do something, he is going to do it. He is the great I am, and the only question left is, am I willing to trust the great I am? As we move throughout this series, Jesus, through the phrase I am, is picking up on this statement from God to Moses in the burning bush. He is stating, I am still that God who is with my people. I am who I am. And each time he uses that phrase, he'll add to it. Next week will be, I am the bread of life. And then he will go on to use that to tell people his plan of how he will nourish them. He will give them nourishment. He will tell them the continuation of how the great I am God is still at work with his people, and he is the only source of nourishment they need. But we need to understand who we are based off of who God is. If he is the great I am, then the question we need to ask is, am I willing to trust the great I am? Do you trust that God will do what he said he will do? Do you trust that Jesus' death covers our sins, even the ones that you'd be ashamed if anyone in this room knew? He still died for that sin. He still forgives. Do you trust that he can transform your life into something greater than you can imagine if you will just go all in and submit to him like Moses did, even though Moses was pretty sure he wasn't the right guy for the job? Do you trust that he has given you his word, both as a promise and as a guide for all of our thoughts, all of our ways? Do you trust that he is faithful to return and take with him his devoted followers? Do you trust that he is preparing a place for you, that you will be with him where he is? Do you trust in the great I am? And that with him, you have a purpose and a mission. He is God, and he will continue to be God for us. Are we willing to trust the great I am? Well, it's true that we are not being called to be the leader of a nation subject to slavery, with God asking us to negotiate before Pharaoh. That's not us. That was Moses. We are still in a very similar state as Moses as we approach the I am. Moses had all sorts of objections to God's plan, but all of them were centered around what or who Moses thought he was and what he could do. God was saying to Moses, trust me. I have a plan. I am all you need. We act very similarly when it comes to trusting that God is moving in our own lives. We and Moses say, I'm not the right person. I am not the right person for this. And God says, I am. We say, I'm not smart enough. And God says, I am. We say, I am unqualified. And God says, I am qualified. We say, I'm not smart enough. God says, I am. I said that twice. I didn't realize that. We say, I'm not good enough. I say this all the time. God says, I am. God will do what God will do. He will be faithfully God for us, and we need to stop trying to trust in who we think we are and start putting our trust in the great I am.